This is great because I don't have to look too much at my notes, which is good because I left my reading glasses in the car. No. So I want to riff on Joe's idea, but first just give a little bit of some other things that I was going to give you as background. And Max, in his long bibliography that he showed there, one of the things was a study that we did that came out in spring of 2014 called Paying for Water, where we looked in detail across the whole water system at what the needs are, how we pay for it, and everything. And I will say that urban water supply agencies came out looking pretty good compared to pretty much everybody else. The urban wastewater agencies was the other group that was looking pretty good in the sense of being able to generally raise the income that they needed to do their O&M and to do investments, and that in general they're investing at a healthy pace. And I do agree with Lester that the drought has highlighted that we need to do some more things. A lot of those things are in the nature of integrated management projects where it's about combining with others, and you got to figure out how you're going to split those costs, and that's where Prop 218 gets complicated. And then about conservation, and that's where Prop 218 gets complicates the issues for them. But overall, starting from a not bad place, and I think doing okay and raising money for their core business. Now, concerns. One of them is that costs are rising faster than inflation, if you look at monthly bills. And that's still really affordable for pretty much, for most people, but there's a looming affordability issue within urban agencies for low-income households. And this is where the lifeline issue comes up. A lot of agencies do have lifelines, but they are based on either grandfathered allowances pre-Prop 218, or they're based on non-rate revenues like property tax revenues. If you want to increase your lifeline budget now and do the typical kind of thing we're used to from energy, where there's a cross subsidy or there's a contribution from all ratepayers to it, you would have to, that would basically be considered a tax for publicly owned water agencies. And I think that's a concern to think about in terms of potential constitutional reform. Now, conservation pricing. Max gave a really nice introduction on this issue, and I think I just want to clarify or add one piece to that, which is the real hard nut to crack here is the fact that 70 or 80% of the costs are fixed. And so if you want to, as an agency, just cover your costs in a reliable way as a water agency, you would have a very high fixed monthly part of your bill and a very small volumetric component of your bill. Now, California for a while has been saying that's not a good idea because you want to have the volumetric part in order to incentivize people to reduce consumption. And in fact, and I think the next panel, I think Heather may be talking more about this, but we have best management practices that actually direct utilities to pretty much flip it and cover 70% with their volumetric and only 30% with fixed. Now, this is a challenge in general for utilities because that means you got to kind of guess or have an idea of what your volumetric revenue is going to bring in to be able to cover the whole thing. In a drought, when people are being asked to really save, it's a bigger challenge because chances are you're not going to be able to, you'll be in the red unless you've got reserves or unless you've got a drought surcharge that you can put on there. And what you're going to be seeing is cannibalization of investments if this goes on for a while. And we saw this already in the data that we looked at we look at 2008 to 2011, and you could see that just the effects of that drought, which was a small one, and the water conservation there was starting to eat away at investments that were happening. So over the longer term, you have to just really think, okay, what's the structure that's going to keep them fiscally whole and that's going to not be inequitable, and this is where a fixed service charge is regressive. If you just lop a lot of fixed fees on bills, the proportion of the income of low-income households is much higher than it is for high-income households. Volumetric fees are much more progressive in the sense that lower-income households tend to use less. So kind of balancing that mix of fiscal stability, providing incentives for conservation, and not being and meeting some social justice and equity standards, it's complicated. There's no one single formula for doing it. And I think 218 makes it much harder. And I think the ruling in San Juan Capistrano that I'm sure you'll hear about more, especially in the last panel, was very thoughtfully written, and the judge clearly was thinking about the conservation objectives that the state also needs to meet. The thing that concerned me when I read it was the impression that it left that it could be that it's a precise science. It's not, because there's a lot of guesstimating and estimating there, and you're not going to get it right to the decimal point. So with that as background, a few things to think about in terms of what needs to happen, and I'm teeing partly off of what we said back then, and then I want to riff off of Joe and Lester. First is locals can do some things better, and the transparency piece of 218 is very good. Getting these agencies out of the shadows, public notice, all of that, making a clear case for why you're raising rates. I think that locals also could do a way better job on communicating about the fixed cost issue in relation to giving people advance warning that we're in a drought. This is a community water system. We got to raise rates in order to cover our costs. So it's not just a surprise at the end. Thank you very much for conserving, and now I'm going to raise your bill. Anticipate it's anticipatable, and we should give customers a little benefit of the doubt that we can inform them about it. Now, what things that can be done in terms of short of constitutional reform? Because I think, I'll just say, I agree with Lester, constitutional reform would be very helpful on lifeline rates, on dealing with some of the orphan issues that we're not talking about here, like stormwater and floods, in terms of making it easier to get those rates passed, get those fees passed, but then also on this issue of connecting, making water rates setting and Prop 218 more consistent with Article 10, Section 2, and kind of making it more consistent with waste and unreasonable use, and the goal of, basically the state's goal of management of water in an integrated, modern way. Sometimes 218 just is clunky, and it gets in the way of that. So what it means is getting away from the decimal point type notion of linking cost of services. I'll come back to that, but sort of things how the legislature can help, and maybe the board can also help. I think there are ways in which, and Max showed, the allocation-based legislation in 2008 basically kind of providing guidance in a way to the courts that this is something that's we think is a good idea. The legislature could also put in place a statute of limitations for court challenges to some of the 218 to rates, so that you can't just come in whenever you feel like it after there's been public noticing and it's been adopted. I think we suggested maybe a 90-day limit, something like that. And then let's talk about this idea that Joe raised for a second about the board having a penalty, or putting in place a notion of what's reasonable use. I think that that's actually very similar to what some local agencies do now with allocation-based rates. The base tier is reasonable use, right? It's a certain amount per indoor. It's a certain amount, with some norms for outdoor that are based on technical efficiency guidelines. So I think that that's an interesting idea to explore in terms of the board doing it. I think that is also a way that we could think about integrating and making consistent Article 10, Section 2 and Prop 218, because what is water service? Water service is not about providing service that's waste. It's about providing a service that's reasonable. And so you could have this norm, and that can change in an extreme drought. Maybe you got to tighten your belt some, so you would tamp down on the normal time norms, for example. But that's your service, and then above that is waste and unreasonable use, and therefore not service, and therefore slap a penalty on it. And I think it's consistent. It's something that locals could do. It's harder, probably, given the process right now and the legal threats of 218, and that's where, as a stopgap, certainly the state could be really could provide a very useful function there in doing it, because the state is not subject to 218 for this. but we should be thinking about making that something that is possible in a durable way for locals to do. And it's basically allocation-based rates, where you're not worried about upper tiers being linked precisely to the marginal cost of the additional source. And I'm worried that Ken Barenclough, my colleague from UCR, who knows a lot about these rates as an economist, is going to kick me out of the economist club now. But anyway,
I have a question. Lester mentioned about creating some kind of a fee that would be a regular investment fund, whereas a penalty charge, if everyone is wonderful, over time erodes.
those are two different things, and I'm glad you asked that question, because I did want to say that this is one of the things that we recommend is some kind of a surcharge on water to cover the stuff that's not being covered well now. And so that's kind of what we called orphans. And there are a variety of things there. One of them is specifically addressing kind of you could think of a statewide lifeline rate for these small economically disadvantaged communities that cannot cover their O&M. It's reasonable to think of Californians as a whole as contributing to that in an ongoing way. So a piece of it would be for that. A piece of it would be for helping to fund, another fiscal orphan for us was integrated water management, which has mainly been bond supported. And you could think of that as kind of as Lester's drought, reliability surcharge, getting us on, helping to fund these the cost shares of these kind of frontier projects, where often some of the partners are weak, like the stormwater agencies are fiscally weak. They cannot easily come up with their piece of the pie. So have that contribute to that. Habitat and ecosystem issues are another orphan, and often we're not paying for the external costs of our projects in the way that we need to be, especially some of the things that are not so much forward-looking investments as they are cleaning up after our messes and finding a way to do that. So I would have that as a revenue source. The penalty, you hope you don't have to use it, but if you do, then you want to funnel that into conservation programs and the kind of things like Irvine Ranch Water District is doing, where they fund also the cleanup of urban slobber, dry season runoff, which hopefully you don't have if you're not wasting, but if you do, you got to clean it up.
And I want to add, I agree 100%. It's two things. I think we need to absolutely have some kind of a drought resiliency fund or something that helps us deal with all those issues that are unfunded, and that I don't see that as a penalty on anybody or anything like that.
So, good morning, I'm Jean Clinton. I'm a bit of the outsider on the panel this morning. I've been asked to speak to the nature and structure of public goods charge on the energy side and how that might offer some insights for the water side. But first, I just want to put a little context on the rate discussion, if I may. So I'm sure, as all the board members know, the State Public Utilities Commission regulates a very small amount of urban water consumption in California, 15% of the urban water consumption, delivered by about 40 investor-owned water companies that we regulate. And just for context on this conversation, I was sort of consulting yesterday with the folks in the water division, and number one, they do offer discounts for low-income households. Number two, they do offer water conservation programs, and both of which are mandated by us as regulators. And they do have water rate structures that include both fixed service and variable commodity charges. So on average, 30% of the revenue requirement comes from the service charge, and 70% comes from the volumetric charges, which are structured as tiers. So the more you use, the more you pay. And that's not true across the board yet with all the really some of the small companies, but it's definitely true for what we call the Class A companies that are bigger ones that are delivering 96% of to the customers that we regulate. So the other comment I wanted to make on the water rate structure is that given the concerns about variability and the commodity sales and what that means for revenue, we do have what's called a water revenue adjustment mechanism, and it allows for the automatic recovery of any shortfall in revenue expectations because of a drop-off in volume. And, that's not just a straight across the board equation, because there's some savings in variable costs if you're not selling as much water in terms of delivery costs and treatment costs. So it basically is an adjustment mechanism that recovers the net loss of revenue, minus any variable cost savings. But it's an automatic thing. So I just wanted to comment on that, on the structure. And then quickly on the low-income bill discounts, those there are certain eligibility criteria. I'm just going to give you the general framework. About 20% of the urban water customers qualify for the low-income discount. They get an average discount of about $18 a month. It varies from $5 to $20 across the companies. The total cost of the annual subsidy amounts to 3.7% of the annual revenue requirement. So just to provide some metrics without going into detail. And on the conservation side, the conservation expenditures amount to between 0.5% and 1% of the revenue requirement. And that, in this case of, a small number of water companies, small portion of the urban water, it amounts to between $7 and $14 million a year of expenditure on water conservation. So just for an investor-owned water company framework. Then turning...
Before you go on to dealing with electricity, we got one letter of the many letters that came in from Michael Hanneman, and it was a professor at Berkeley. I think he now lives in Arizona, but he knows the CPUC system as well as the public system as well quite well, and he suggested that the State Water Board and the PUC partner in a broad review of the state of the urban water industry in California, including the state of our existing water supply infrastructure, the adequacy of ongoing maintenance efforts, the potential need for new infrastructure investment in the face of population growth, economic development, and potential climate change, the strengthening of water conservation programs, and developing rates that balance investment, conservation, and affordability. Now, what I read into this paragraph, which may or may not be what he intended, is that there should be a much tighter connection between what is done in public agencies and what is done in private agencies. Right now, the CPUC regulates the private customers or private entities, and that was set up a long time ago. There is no real, guidance requirement like what you find at the PUC for public agencies, and so I don't know that you know public agencies that well that you can opine on this, but in terms of what you have seen at the PUC, do you see it having a broader application to the state as a whole, to all utilities?
Well, I've been around for a while, and once upon a time I worked for the Palo Alto Municipal Utility, which was a water, sewer, gas, electric municipal utility. So I do have some exposure. It's a complicated question. California has a history of having both publicly owned let's just call them utilities or agencies, and private, and the mix varies. On the water side, it's very skewed to public. On the natural gas side, it's 99% private. With electric, you've got about 70% or so investor-owned and another 25 or 30% publicly owned. So you've got all different mixes. So I think the principles of how do you pay for certain customer service needs, how do you do long-term resource planning, how do you decide sort of demand-side, supply-side investment requirements, how do you factor in climate, those issues are there for everyone. The fundamental, maybe legal, institutional environments are different in terms of what you can and can't do, or what kind of decision-making you have, how centralized or decentralized it is. So the short answer is there's certainly room for sharing of insights, knowledge, and ideas. And I'm sure that the folks who work on the water side at the Public Utilities Commission are happy to engage on issues. At the same time, they probably are viewing that they're only 15% of the urban water. So while they may have experience and lessons to contribute, there's a limit of how much time they're going to want to devote to participating in statewide public forums, because they have their day jobs. So I won't speak for them. But I definitely think on an intellectual basis, in terms of theory and practice of revenue issues, service issues, resource issues, community stewardship, those issues can certainly be shared.
And obviously, one of the things I meant to ask is, obviously our colleagues at DWR are also part of this mix. I mean, we've stepped in to do these, we do have the Waste and Unreasonable Use Authority, but we were given the authority over the conservation regs, and we have this great forum where we can more transparently meet every couple of weeks and talk with folks. But I also think I may be a weird regulator. I don't think everything needs to have government at the center of it, and I do believe in the principle of subsidiarity. So I think a bit of it is the knowledge sharing, but you do have AQUA and you do have other forums where agencies do come together. And so for me, the issue is, where can we add assistance? Sometimes it may be using some authority, to be sure. Other times it's creating a forum, and other times it's creating this community conversation that may highlight an issue. So part of what I'm hoping to get a little bit of enlightenment. So I'm just demonstrating why it's important to be near the mic. But also then that very hard question of what is the appropriate role for us and where we can be helpful. I mean, just because something might be a good idea doesn't mean we should do it. And that's where you saw that look on my face. Even in Australia, where they did set very tough conservation goals, half of what we might be doing even in our best communities, they did that voluntarily. Actually, a lot of it. And they did it as a community, and they did it through tons of communication. Again, a little easier for them when the major cities in their states are 80% of the population of the state. It's easier to have a conversation than here. But again, what the appropriate public policy role of government is one that I want to figure out. There may be things we can do. I think there probably are a lot of things we can do, but choosing which ones are the appropriate ones, I think, is the trick. And the dialogue.
Ultimately, what we're talking about is changing culture and regulation. If you just do regulation and culture is changing, it will fail. And so I don't want to advocate that you do that, but I think if you think about, well, we need to set standards somehow, and there should be a carrot and a stick. So I think in the letter I sent, one of the things I suggested is, if an agency can show that 90% of their customers are meeting these standards, then instead of giving them whatever the percentage of reduction was that you gave them, you say, in a drought, we want you to do 4%, because you are, in all likelihood, an outstanding example of how we should manage our water resources. So you end up, agencies in that case get a real benefit. And I just want to say that somehow having that standard and getting people to understand what it is really important. And if we, and you guys have the ability to help set that standard and say there's no smoking in restaurants, or whatever the step is that causes people to say, maybe we need to rethink what we're doing.
I appreciate your comments and would like to get a better sense of, aside from suggestions, legal authority, and also just because it's a good idea doesn't mean that we necessarily have to do it. So getting back to, I think, Max's presentation about information, it would be helpful to have a better sense of what's going on where, have a map and see, where are the shining stars. I think we have a sense, but it'd be better to have the accurate information of who's doing conservation pricing, where is it occurring, and in those areas, especially, I suspect there's going to be certain regions where they seem to be out of the game altogether. What's going on there? What are the challenges? Is it technical challenges that they have? Is it that they're just overwhelmed with providing services because of basic infrastructure challenges? Or is it just something that evolves through time and sort of spreads, a good idea spreads regionally? And I just don't have a guess, but not a good enough sense of what's going on out there, the lay of the land.
And we will go back to Ms. Clinton because she didn't get to the main point she wanted to make, but go ahead. I'm sorry. We just
No, I was just going to say on the data point, there used to actually be a survey that was done every other year by Black & Veatch, the engineering consulting firm, up in, I think the last one was 2006, and it was like 300 some utilities, had type of rate structure, had information on connection fees, had information on single-family monthly bills. It was just a treasure trove. The recession hit, and that doesn't happen anymore. And this would be the kind of easy, low-hanging fruit, I think. Max asked about data, and that the state could do. Just when an agency updates its rates, send it to someplace. It gets posted. There's a place where people can look, and at least it would be easy to find. And ideally, you'd have somebody kind of collating the basic information so that you could get that snapshot. It won't get you all the details, but it'll give you the first high-level view, which is almost impossible to have now.
Okay. Just one personal observation on that question about the role of the board and what it tackles. I would make the observation that I had the personal, professional experience about 10, 15 years ago of working at the California Power Authority, which no longer exists at the time of the energy crisis. And it's a very small agency. It's 10 people. But we were the valiant David and the Goliath of the energy world.
literally the David.
Literally, yes. But I just make the observation that we gave ourselves the assignment to do an energy resource investment plan that sort of looked strategically at what the energy sector needed to be reliable and affordable, et cetera, and carved out a short list of issues. And then we took them to our colleagues at the Public Utilities Commission or at the Energy Commission or at the legislature and said, here are some gaps that we think need attention. And we think the PUC could do X and Y, and the Energy Commission could do A and B, and maybe the legislature could do, LMN. And we played a sort of a messenger, networker, gap filler, David role. And I think, that was very helpful, I think. So just a observation. Now, let me turn briefly to some basic things about, on the energy side, what some people call the public good charge funded activities. We refer to more broadly as public purpose programs, because once upon a time, many of these were funded through a particular revenue mechanism called the public goods charge, but over time that has changed and the activities persist, but the revenue sources have modified. So I don't want to get too caught up on the specific source, other than to say the original public goods...
It's like a four-letter word to some people in the water arena, so calling it something else is probably a good idea.
So there was early on statutory direction by the legislature to do certain things, to fund certain things that were perceived to be otherwise not going to be addressed in a competitive market situation. The legislature authorized a 10-year initial period for the public goods charge, subject to sunset unless renewed. The legislature did not choose to renew most aspects of the public goods charge in 2011, but all of the functions continue, and there have been other ways found to support these. Now, let me talk just very briefly about the elements. There's an energy efficiency element, both what we call sort of mainstream and then a dedicated efficiency programs for low-income households. There's a low-income bill discount element. There's an R&D element. And there was a renewable element paying for the above market costs of renewables. So those are the elements. I think the ones that are most relevant to the conversation here are the efficiency, or you might refer to it as conservation, the bill discounts, and potentially long-term the R&D. So in round numbers, on the efficiency side, the combined spend for both the mainstream and low income as collectively is about 4% of the revenue requirement. And that's split 3% on the mainstream and 1% on the low income. I might add that the mainstream programs are designed to compete with, avoiding the alternative cost of supplying energy. So there's an economic framework for choosing what gets done and how much money makes sense to spend. On the low income side, it's not limited to avoiding supply. There are additional objectives of reducing cost burden, helping on comfort, helping on safety. So those are all additional elements on the low income side. The bill discount is now statutorily mandated to have a target range of providing a 30 to 35% discount on the bill. And that's mandated on the electric bill. We also have comparable discounts on the gas side. I would say in round numbers, the cost in terms of revenue requirement that has to be met is about 3% of the revenue requirement is dedicated to this low-income bill discount. It gets substantial on the electric side. We're talking about over $1 billion a year that are spent in cost discounts, whereas on the gas side it's about $200 million a year. But I think it's more helpful to frame it as a percentage of revenue requirement for comparison. So roughly 3% if combined electric and gas. And then there's also the R&D component, which has several components funding not only new technologies, but new ways of making the system work in an integrated fashion, reducing losses, being smarter about managing operations and things like that. And in round numbers, the R&D spend is about 0.2%, just for comparison. And my final comment is that the low-income customers do not bear a cost contribution to most of these subsidies or programs. So the revenue requirements to pay for these are allocated over all customers who are not the low-income customers. So I think that's probably enough.
I'm going to stand up here as moderator and just ask the panel a question. So all of you have talked about funding and how we do funding in some way or form. We just passed the legislature passed a over $7 billion water bond last year, which funds some of the things we're talking about, but not all of them. Certainly there are orphans that Ellen, you mentioned. So my question is this, is the water bond funding model something that should continue? Or do we need to move towards some type of fee-based model, or do we need both?
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but we need to move away from general obligation bonds as a way to incentivize these kinds of investments. I mean, I think we've even heard the governor talk about wanting to reduce the state's bonded indebtedness and the kind of payments that we need to make on that. So I think we need to move our primary focus to a more stable revenue stream. That's not to say that we may not need at some point a bond for some specific purpose, or an extra jump on some kinds of investments. But I don't think we can make the improvements we need to make by speculating about when we're going to pass the next bond. And $7 billion is nice, but it's a down payment.
All right,
I
well, you're
think
going to say
that
it's better than nice, but it's just a down payment. Don't we get to say yippee for a while? I mean, it's awesome, but it's
Okay,
just a
it's-
down payment.
There you go. I like that. It's awesome, but it's just a down. Is that better?
That was a big deal. Sorry.
it's not that I have a philosophical opposition to geo bonds. I think there are places for them. I just think in terms of reliability, we don't know that we're going to be able to rely on the general fund moving ahead. And as a manager of a utility, counting on something that will come along once every 2 years, once every 10 years, at irregular intervals is not the way to do the kind of investments that we need to do in the system. So I think some other financing mechanisms are really called for. I agree with Lester. There are times when, if we can do it, a geo bond is a wonderful thing.
So I think it's a combination, but I think it's about thinking, where is the geo bond or state tax, general fund taxes. Let's think of general fund taxes are what pays for the geo bond. So to me, there's not that much difference. It's one is stretching out the payment and one is kind of doing it pay as you go. But they have an advantage for some things because it is a progressive source of revenue. I would especially think about them for the kind of things that I don't think a water fee is appropriate for, like flood protection, which mostly I don't see the rationale for putting flood protection. We have a huge bill to pay on flood protection to get us to where we need to be in California, and I don't see the rationale for putting that on water users. There are a lot of other things water users should be paying for through a surcharge, I think, and we've talked about them. So, but the state is going to have to help locals pay for flood protection, and I think we need to do that through tax revenues, and whether it's a bond or whether it's a regular pay-as-you-go infusion, that's a good thing to do.
One sort of a follow-up on that.
Moment or something.
Yeah. So in terms of low-income rate assessments, we have, over 1 million people, almost 2 million people who don't have access to safe and clean drinking water in the state, and we know that that's a priority. And we have thousands of different water supply utilities. We have about 400 big ones, but we have many, many more. If we're going to have a comprehensive assistance program for low-income customers, how do we do that? What's the right way to fund that?
Has anyone mentioned a fee approach to this? I think that's a part of it, and maybe that's a little too simplistic. I mean, there's a number of layers, I think, to low-income assistance. We have some isolated communities that there needs to be an investment, and then where does the O&M money come from? The other part of low income is the lifeline rate, or in the PUC system, it's the low income rate assistance program. Which works very well. I think we need a much more standardized approach to this. I'll make a comment about investor-owned utilities a little more broadly, and disclosing I'm on the board of an investor-owned utility, but there's a couple things that just work really, really well with the PUC, and they have the Office of Ratepayer Advocates, and so the general rate case goes into them, and through a long, at times arduous process, there's agreement on the demand projections and what the sales forecasts are going to be. And then they have decoupled revenue from conservation. And so if you sell more than you agreed to, then you rebate it back to the customer. And if you conserve a lot of water, then you get that in the future, it comes back to you. There's just some of those systems in the regulated utility world work very well. And the LIRA program is one of them, an agreement on demand, and then having the decoupling with a balancing fund works very well.
Have you looked at the May Revise authority that was given to the Division of, to us and the Division of Drinking Water for consolidation as a component of this? Because a lot of the consolidation will probably be among low-income facilities that just simply aren't able to
Right.
to provide clean, safe drinking water on a reliable basis. So does that figure into your thinking here?
Well, it does with a question in my mind. I think in general, when we identify problems with water management in California, fragmentation is always somewhere near the top of the list, and so that's an illustration of fragmentation compounded by income and disadvantaged community issues. So consolidation is a good thing, and I think when the package came out, I think we made statements in support of the consolidation, but with the caveat of recognizing that there's financial issues that go with that. You may have a relatively well-run district that now picks up a district in terrible condition, and so there's a financial obligation and potentially actually a liability, a legal liability associated with that. So we need to make sure we have funds and assistance to deal with those issues. But I don't see how we address some of these problems that we have without consolidation.
Consolidation is a way of reducing the unit cost. It's not necessarily a way of bringing in the money that you need. So it makes it possible to manage, even if it's not physical consolidation, even if it's kind of an administrative consolidation where you can have the same tech person going around checking on things and managing. So that's all really good, and I think that's a positive piece of it. But then you do need some durable way of contributing financially if systems aren't able to do this. And back to Max's question, to me, the state fund should be more about helping with entire communities that are not able to cover their costs, whereas for most urban agencies, it's really the appropriate way to do this is within the service area with some kind of a lifeline rate within the service area. There's no reason why where I live in San Francisco, we shouldn't be able to do that internally. I mean, we do now, but I don't know how we pay for it exactly. It's probably grandfathered.
But you don't see that working in the disadvantaged community areas?
The challenge is for the small disadvantaged communities is that the unit costs are very high and the average incomes are low. So there's a high cost and low ability to pay, which means you often are going to need outside funding to come in. And we've gotten better now as a state at identifying this problem and at getting some capital available and improving. Now you've got an office to help move that money and everything. And I think that the missing gap still there is the piece related to ongoing O&M. And it's not a question of just blanket saying whatever the costs, we're going to pay for it. There's still a lot of kind of detailed work that needs to be done to see how do you design the most durable, least cost system. And that's where consolidation can help. But money needs to come into that too.
But I'm trying to better understand a public goods type charge in those communities. So would there be challenges with lifeline rates in disadvantaged communities, even where you have consolidation?
So if there's a consolidation, let's say Fresno adds a couple of the, and I know this is under discussion, incorporates, includes a couple of the small communities around the margin there, it's quite possible that just, it's a big enough system, there's enough income diversity in that system that you could just include that in a regular Lifeline rate program. It's more an issue, a challenge if you've got, communities that are not connected to a big area where you don't have the overall income base. And there, it's not so much about a Lifeline charge within that system. It's more about how do you provide funding to support it. And this is where, either you can just look to bonds, but it's hard to do the O&M with bonds unless we, change the language in some ways, or you do it with general fund contributions, or you figure out some other way, like a small surcharge on water use. And I'll just say that several other states do have, I think it's like a penny per 1,000 gallons for safe drinking water programs specifically for this kind of thing.
If I could just jump in on that, I think it's really important to keep in mind this capital versus operating cost differentiation. And if I bring in the example of telecommunications and broadband, we have both federal and state sort of universal service charges or high cost of service charges where, and granted, these are mostly private telco companies, but where everybody is paying into a fund, and then, for example, on telco, the PUC administers the high cost fund, and then it goes through. It's intended to be used to help bring service to high cost of service areas, either to extend service that they don't have now or to upgrade the service. And it's sort of a pooled fund. Then there's a bit of a competitive process to allocate, and you could figure out what the criteria are. It could be need, it could be leverage of the funds. I imagine there are other criteria, but that initially gets at the capital cost of putting the infrastructure in place. And then the question of what do you do with high operating costs, that comes back to this question of, well, can you afford the Lifeline rate within the service area of that water agency or energy agency or telecommunications? Or is there a deeper need for operating cost support, just use a neutral term? And the one thing that our the water folks back at the PUC shared with me yesterday was they said, unlike energy utilities, which tend to be large, at least on the private side, when they look at the water companies, there's quite a diverse range of the effective cost burden for this low-income bill discount. And, Palo Verde's doesn't have much of a cost burden, and other, privately served water companies have a much higher cost burden. So there's an equity question that they think needs some serious statewide attention.
I agree with all those concerns. I want to point out one of the concerns I have. I think the state has to somehow be involved, but I think the state can't say to people, no matter where you live, no matter what it costs, we'll find a way to deliver water to you, because at some point it's not sustainable. If somebody moves out to, or a group of people move out to the middle of the Mojave Desert, and it's going to cost $5,000 an acre foot to provide water, and that small group of people doesn't have the money to pay that, I think there has to be some limit on that. And that's a difficult public policy issue, but one that I'm sure you're capable of dealing with.
Well, there are plenty of communities that are where they are through, in some ways, no fault of their own. So we have plenty to go through before we get to that level where folks are asking for an extension of service. And I think we've said no to some folks recently, actually, who are
Yeah, and there probably
create
are
whole
communities.
developments on hauled water.
Stop the bleeding.
So in order to keep us on track, I think we're going to take our break. So I want to thank our panelists.
Can I just interrupt? I'm sorry. I do want to hear about the population issue, how you pick a number. And Joe didn't talk about it in his opening, but said he was willing to talk about it a little bit.
So for us, the big issue is typically we've gone with the highest numbers, and we've been going through a fairly intense process looking at population and working with our local member agencies. But it's not just the population number, it's also the density of the development, because more dense development uses much less water. And looking at, as I mentioned earlier, for new development, our newer developments are using less than 40 gallons per person per day on indoor use, but most of our member agencies had been assuming 55 or even 60 gallons per person per day. So actually, the last meeting I was at, we actually pointed out we'd have people out monitoring flows so we could say, no, this is actually what it really is, because we did the testing in the system to say this is what they're actually using. And it's a process of working, in our case, with the member agencies, all the cities, and saying, here's what the real water use numbers are likely to be. And so you still don't have an exact number, but it's actually brought it down to the point where the bottom end of our alligator jaws, that's what our planning folks call the future projections, are lower than our current use, even though we're projecting growth of another 50%.
Okay, so thank you all. Very productive discussion. So we're going to take an approximately 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for our second panel.